Thank you very much, Chair. The main points I wish to make involve the moral logic underpinning the legalisation of assisted suicide and/or voluntary euthanasia. For shorthand, I use the term euthanasia to refer to both, and by that term I mean the deliberate medical cooperation in a competent person's autonomous choice to end their own life. My remarks here are explained and defended in greater detail in my written submission. The unique distinguishing feature of euthanasia is the consensual intentional killing of the patient. Introducing death as a legitimate healthcare intention would not be a mere expansion of healthcare. Rather, it could only be introduced by disavowing a primary healthcare norm: no intentional killing. The norm against intentional killing is a moral requirement necessary to protect equally the life of every person, which is of profound inherent worth, from being attacked. When the norm is sidelined to accommodate euthanasia, it can no longer be maintained consistently that every human life is of intrinsic, equal, and inviolable worth. For the new law would now facilitate an individual to judge that their life has lost or is losing value such that death is preferable to life, and, on the basis of that judgment, to choose death and thus to treat their life as violable. Here, legal facilitation occurs precisely out of moral respect for both the individual's judgment and their choice, the choice being contingent on the judgment. Euthanasia, then, is a violation of the intrinsic value of life. Since a person is inseparable from their life, euthanasia is also a violation of persons. It ends them through death, which itself is both a harm and a loss. Against this, the central euthanasia rationale argues that choices for death are morally protected by the respect owed to individual autonomy, insofar as expressions of autonomy concern the most important self-regarding decisions one makes in relation to one's life. It is a rationale which, once accepted, becomes the most important and directly relevant moral standard by which euthanasia restrictions and safeguards are to be judged. Acceptance of euthanasia's autonomy rationale requires thinking very differently about killing and death. Outside the euthanasia framework, they are considered inherently bad, but inside the framework, consensual death and killing are judged positively as morally protected expressions of autonomy. Hence, acceptance of the autonomy rationale requires rejecting attempts to restrict euthanasia in order to limit consensual deaths. This poses a problem for proposals to legalise euthanasia insofar as such proposals advocate restrictions. When legalisation of euthanasia occurs per the autonomy rationale, there appears to be no consistent, non-arbitrary justification for limiting euthanasia access. Any line drawn between a legitimate and illegitimate euthanasia ground, or between an acceptable and unacceptable annual number of cases, will appear as unfair discrimination against patients excluded from the right to access euthanasia. Consistency demands that should euthanasia be legalised, it will be available on virtually all medical grounds, e.g. chronic illness, conditions closely associated with disability, experience of suffering, which is inherently subjective and not limited to physical suffering, and mental disorders once capacity remains. Tellingly, pro-euthanasia contributions at committee have generally avoided affirming euthanasia restrictions. It thus becomes clear that the real principled moral choice is not between no euthanasia and very limited euthanasia. Rather, it is between no euthanasia and largely unrestricted euthanasia. As such, euthanasia becomes more obviously a rejection of a fundamentally important ethical norm: no intentional killing. Indeed, the fact that restrictive euthanasia provision is arbitrary helps illustrate how principled, coherent and protective is the norm against intentional killing. A legislative decision to reject that norm is much more ethically momentous than any subsequent decision to widen euthanasia grounds. It follows that a restrictive euthanasia model, like the Oregon model, amounts to an ad hoc, unstable compromise with an inbuilt orientation towards expansion of euthanasia grounds and increase in euthanasia cases. The orientation is demonstrated in the clear general trend towards expansion in countries that have had legalised euthanasia for 5 years or more. All have seen a substantial increase in annual euthanasia cases, and for those that legislate for grounds, all bar one has witnessed significant widening of grounds, whether occurring de facto or de jure or both. The movement is in one direction. If anything, it is accelerating. As my written submission explains, Oregon itself is subject to the trend of expansion, and there is no reason to think that New Zealand, itself based on the Oregon model, will prove any different. These trends support the claim that the idea of limited euthanasia is both morally incoherent and practically unstable. Our proposal to legalise euthanasia requires very careful thought about moral principles and about moral consistency. Legislators should inhabit the central rationale of each of the two basic possible positions and think through whether a middle ground genuinely makes sense, or whether even a small step on a new path involves a radical reorientation away from key goods enshrined in the status quo. A reorientation which leads to a very different way of viewing healthcare, the quality of human lives, killing and death, solidarity and the good. Currently, as a matter of clear, coherent, basic principle, our healthcare excludes choices to self-kill. Within the euthanasia framework, though, a consensual choice in favour of death becomes a principal part of good healthcare. There is no stable middle ground. The current law is the only credible safeguard on offer against the normalisation of consensual killing in healthcare.
Thank you very much, Doctor. And now, Professor Kevin.